Welcome to Finance at the Jobsite, the podcast where construction finance meets the field. I'm your host, Rishi Srivastava, founder of Being Human. In each episode, I sit down with construction CFOs, controllers, owners, project managers, IT leaders, ERP consultants, and industry experts to uncover how they connect the back office with the field, choose and implement technology, manage cash flow, and drive profitable projects. Whether you are running the numbers, leading the team, or designing the systems that keep projects moving, this is your place to learn what's working, what's broken, and what's next in construction finance. Today, our guest is Samuel McAravey. Samuel, welcome.
Hey, how's it going?
Okay. First section here is on your background. Samuel, before we get into the tech side, can you share your journey from software engineering to leading global teams and building platforms in the construction finance space?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I started out as a pretty classical software engineer, but pretty early on, I kept on getting pulled in towards that messy mess in the middle, if you will. So it wasn't just simply, oh, I write some software and I'm done. It was constantly, how do you deal with weird things going on with the finances and in accounting, Early years, it was a lot of dealing with ERP systems and just kind of dealing with that mess. But then not too long after that, I started working a lot more with sort of the FinTech side of things. So a lot of the accounting, invoicing, and how to actually move the money around. I found out that people get very, very touchy if you make a mistake with their money. It's so that was early lessons learned very quickly. And these days when you look at construction finance, it's all of that, but turned up to level 11. People get very upset if their money is slow, late to get to you. Anything goes wrong, they get very upset. And it makes sense. I mean, in no other industry have I really seen it being common for a 90-day invoice or something like that, So construction has a lot of very unique issues to deal with. It ultimately boiled down to, I found out that while I could write software, I preferred figuring out how to build a system that businesses could trust. You can vibe code your way these days into writing some software, but that doesn't build trust automatically. So, yeah.
When you're writing a real system for real end user, the edge cases can be lots of them there.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I imagine that you've run into that quite a bit with the stuff you've worked with. I mean, is there stuff that you've seen that's kind of broken?
Right, exactly. And vibe coding can be a good start, but without a real systems engineer or an architect, it's very hard to get a reliable working production system.
Yeah, exactly.
You've worked across industries like FinTech, SaaS, and construction tech. What drew you specifically towards the construction technology sector?
Yeah, so construction was very interesting. In some ways, it was a little bit of an accident, but turned out to be, a fascinating industry because it's so big, and yet so much of what drives it turned out to be so manual. It was actually a little unbelievable to some extent at how manual things even are today. I mean, things are getting better, but you still have people dropping checks in the mail, and you still have people meeting in an office to sign a lien waiver. I mean, construction is inherently a physical process, but the back office was really what was surprising to me. So some of the things in construction that were really interesting, I thought, it's real world, high stakes, it's not something that's unimportant. It's a really important industry. And the reliance that construction has on their systems was also a really interesting challenge because everyone needs an ERP system, and everything about the business lives and dies inside that accounting system. And so with everything being so manual, the less friction you can make, the better it can be. One way that I remember thinking about it was it's kind of like an air traffic controller, especially these days. You kind of seen it in the news. If it's all running smoothly, no one ever pays any attention to it. But the moment something goes wrong, everyone's down your throat yelling and screaming at you. So, it's interesting industry for sure.
Yeah. The service providers, we are just like water in the tap. It needs to be always working. It needs to be always there.
Yeah, exactly.
As someone who's led both startups and large scale engineering teams. How has your leadership style evolved over the years?
Yeah, so the kinds of teams that I've led over time, just as a bit of background, um, I started off just being the one individual contributor. And back then that was, you're interested in what work was assigned to you, you just kind of get it done. And sometimes you'd be sort of in hero mode where you got to move fast and get it done. Pretty quickly, I moved on to leading groups of programmers and other engineers. And what you need to do in that case changes. It's a lot more about, can you deliver things reliably, repeatably? Can you not break things and make everyone's life miserable? But since those days, I've moved on to running a number of businesses, even outside of construction and even outside of software to some extent. Leadership to some extent is the same, regardless of what business you're running. But in the construction world, it's extra important because your focuses are on, can you make the right trade-offs without sort of destroying not only your own business, but the people that rely on you, since you're also now a service provider. My leadership style, how it's changed, I'd say it's a lot more focused on making sure you get it right rather than rushing to get something half baked out the door. It's a little hard to put it into, one sentence, if you will, but that's kind of, if you sum it up, what I've mostly come down to. Do it right and do it right the first time.
The next section here, Samuel, is on building and scaling in construction tech. You scaled PayeWaive from concept to an established brand. What were the biggest technical or financial challenges you had to solve early on?
Yeah. So, PayeWaive's the current business that's focused on construction finance. And, well, I'll be blunt, it's not like back office construction software is anything sexy or interesting. So part of the challenges for us is it's not cool. It's not like something you can go out and be like, hey, everyone, look at this awesome thing. We're moving things building things that move money. And so for us, one of the biggest challenges has been this whole thing around building trust. How do I, not only from a system point of view, have something that's reliable, something that's resilient? There's a lot of trade-offs that you make. And all of this is ultimately to say, okay, well, can I convince the people who are touching money, millions of dollars, billions of dollars, that this is something that they can and should rely on? So in some ways, it's not really even a challenge that's technical or financial, but both of those back up, this concept of, can people trust me?
When someone's buying something from you, they don't know how you're going to perform. They can putting their faith on you. And trust is so important, right?
Yeah, exactly. And it's really hard to earn that trust, but just like any other relationship, you screw up once and it's really hard to earn that back again. So having that from day one is critical.
Actually, I'm going through a custody issue with my ex-wife, and that just comes to my mind. Like, once you've lost the trust one time, it's very hard to get back. We are probably going to be in the court here soon.
Yeah, exactly.
What did you learn about product market fit when selling to construction companies that have complex financial workflows?
Yeah, so product market fit, it's a bit of a tricky one. A lot of people that are working in accounting departments, a lot of people that are probably listening to this podcast, they're not really worried about, hey, product market fit. That's not something that kind of crosses their mind. But it does when they start looking for something that they want to buy or maybe to help them. So things that we've seen, they don't, a general contractor isn't going to be interested in, do you have a giant feature set? They're going to be looking at, is there a lot of friction and does it surprise me? They don't want surprises. Those are bad. So they're looking for a service or software that's going to help them. Typically it might be, I really hate having to manually chase down lien waivers all day, every day for the last couple weeks of the month. That might be their pain. So they're going to be looking for something that helps ease the pain. They don't want something that's going to be multiple months to set up and get running, and that's going to be constantly giving them problems. And so for us, when it comes down to a market fit, it's not that we want to be able to cover every possible use case and edge case that's out there. It's, can we find the most painful thing, help make sure that that pain goes away, and that's the best medicine. So If it needs a giant change on the contractor side, it's probably not a good fit and it's probably not going to be successful, at least for them.
Yeah. Are very resistant to change, seems very risky.
Yeah, and I don't blame them. Honestly, general contractors, they have a lot of reasons to be hesitant for any change. But that's why, at least for us, it's where are they feeling the pain the most? And that's the thing that they're most likely to want to change because it hurts so bad. If you're spending hours and days on something which is annoying and makes you miserable, well, look for something that'll make that easier.
You built multi-tenant and ERP integrated systems. What's your perspective on how integration complexity impacts adoption in the construction finance world?
Yeah, so this I'd say to some extent is similar to their conversation just now about, the product fit, because the complexity is in the integration. The integration with the systems and integration with the process, that's really the product. Like in our case with PayeWaive, we're doing a lot of stuff around compliance. Well, anyone could write a compliance tool, but does it treat the ERP system as a gravitational center? Does it tie in nicely? Does it, help? Or is it just going to be another burden? So at the end of the day, clean, tight integration is in some ways almost more important than the product itself. Does it work? Does it work well? Does it make my life easier? The smoother the on-ramp to be onboarded, the more customers get to kind of be on that highway, if you think of it that way.
Yeah. Actually, when you think about these construction ERPs, they don't want you to integrate with them in some way. To keep everything so close is, almost it's like a game to try and integrate with these guys because they have their own game going on.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, also some of them are so old. It's 30 years at least on most of these systems. I think that a lot of the accounting folks could see that. It's painful to use. It's painful to integrate, but that's kind of your only choice.
Yeah. Hopefully, some of these really old systems they're gonna die here in the next few years.
Yeah, well, if I know some of these accounting folks, it would be pried out of my cold dead hands.
When you designed integrations with major ERPs, what surprised you most about the data or processes inside construction accounting systems?
So, well, my gut reaction the first time I looked at some of these accounting systems for construction, it was just like, what am I looking at? Some of them are such a mess. At least when you first look at it, they're just like, okay, why is anyone using the system? But, kind of as time's gone on and I've warmed up to it a little bit, I think I realized just how much of that mess and that complexity was actually the human policies of things. If anyone wanted just simply a way to track and move their money around, okay, that's a very simple system. But now in construction, when you're talking about invoices and payment applications and all the different forms and laws and fees, taxes, everything that you have to do, and how much of it is only focused in construction, it's not surprising that these systems are so big and so complex. A lot of the things that I've seen in these systems, they're pretty implicit with the rules. A lot of times it's, okay, why was something done this way? Oh, it turns out that in construction, well, take my favorite example I like to give to people. With lien waivers, you have an unconditional lien waiver, and it's really like a hostage situation. The vendor doesn't want to hand over their signed waiver until they've got the money, but the GC doesn't want to hand over the money until they have the signed waiver. What do you do? Each system that I've seen, they handle a little bit differently, but at the end of the day, it's a human process. Someone has to decide what they're going to do. And, everyone has a different requirement, a different way of doing things. And it's just, these ERP systems have encoded it in their databases and their programs some way. And, it's integrating with the software is the easy part. It's figuring out what in the world all these habits and what these people do that's so difficult. But that's what people need at the, if someone in the back office at a general contractor, they've spent their entire career working in this way. So it's up to us as a service provider to figure out, okay, how does it work? What do they need? Detangling that whole mess. And yeah, it's complicated for sure.
Sure. The next section here is on finance, operations, and strategy. You've had full P&L responsibility. How do you connect engineering decisions to financial outcomes in your organization?
Yeah, so I'm going to answer that by answering a slightly different question first. So PayeWaive, it's the current business right now that I have full P&L responsibility over. But prior to PayeWaive, I used to run a family business. It was a bakery. And the P&L responsibilities there were similar, but I'd say it's a little more obvious because it's sort of a physical business. Every single day, it was a question of the price of my bread that I'm selling. Does it give me enough profit to pay for the ingredients? Does it pay for the people, pay for the building and the insurance and, my invoicing lead times and this and this and this and this? While it's not software engineering, there was a production process, and every single decision ultimately tied back to, can I afford it? Can it grow the margins on the business? Can it do all the great and wonderful things that we wanted to do? While also trying to check and make sure, well, okay, is this decision I'm about to make, how much risk does it have? Is it dangerous? Is it going to take the business down? Am I going to regret this later? And the same thing happens in a software business. Can I afford to hire these people? Can I spend my resources building out a feature that no one's going to ever use? Ultimately, it's trying to figure out exactly how much time, effort, and money I can put towards solving some of these pain points that people have. Um, so you have to know how to speak the language, margins, risk, exposure. In a business like this, engineering isn't a cost center. It's supposed to be the way you make your margins.
Yeah. I really liked the bakery example. From your experience, what metrics or financial signals tell you that a product or process change is actually driving operational efficiency?
Yeah, so operational efficiency. That's one of those tricky ones. What's the metrics you're going to measure to decide if you're being efficient? Generally speaking, the kinds of things I'm looking for is how much do you have to manually touch the product and how many surprises do you run into? This could be anything from if someone bangs on our door and says, hey, I want to use PayeWaive. How long does it take from them knocking on the door to them having it live in their system? That would be potentially one signal that I would look at. How many times does something break? How many times does someone have to go in there and fix something that fell off the rails? There's a whole slew of different kinds of things that we could look at. But at a high level, I look at it as how many times does a human have to get involved and how many times do things break and surprise us? But if the only metric were things like, velocity, how quickly can I get something out the door? Nothing is ever going to get easier, because you're not shipping value at that point. Now you're just shipping speed. How fast can you drive the truck down the highway?
I really love that. Yeah, because what ultimately customer wants, that's what you want to be building, even if it's like not at the highest speed.
Yeah. And to some extent, I don't want to move fast and break things because, that's the sort of motto in Silicon Valley these days. We would all get yelled at endlessly if we were just constantly breaking things. No one wants that. Not in this industry, at least.
Yeah. Stability matters here for sure.
Yeah.
How can CFOs and controllers better communicate their needs to engineering teams to ensure solutions align with business priorities?
So this was a lesson that took me a little while to learn and to figure out because this isn't always just a matter of, trying to communicate. It really relies on both ends. Oftentimes I would be asked to build something, earlier in my career, and sometimes you just have to do it. You don't really get to ask why. Oftentimes, coming from the other side, I've realized it's not enough to simply say, build this and it'll get done, because almost all the time, the CFO or whoever it is never going to communicate quite enough, and they're going to get something that they don't really want. It's sort of a half-baked version. So what I've realized is especially as someone in a CFO position, don't come asking for features. Don't come asking for a specific button or, email report or something. I mean, sure you could, but it's much better to sort of describe the decisions that are being made, the constraints and the risks that you have. So for example, what are the things that need to be audited? Where does the data come from that we're using to make decisions? What things absolutely cannot break in the system? These are the kinds of things that a CFO should be describing and talking about. So here's an example. So with PayeWaive, you go and you sign your lien waivers and you fill out the schedule of values and do this and that. Those can probably survive a little thing breaking here or there or taking a little longer. But as a CFO, I would turn around and say the one thing that could never break is the payments. When I say move the money needs to move and it needs to move today. So now as someone running an engineering team, I can say the CFO says absolutely cannot break the payments. Therefore, that's where we're going to put all of our focus. And in prior FinTech kinds of companies I've worked at, that's sort of been when that happens is when we have the most success. Many, many times in the past, I've been asked to just build a specific feature or this or that. And sometimes it's mostly what they were thinking of, and sometimes it's not, So yeah, I mean, it's communicate a little more than just simply giving me a wish list. Tell me what it is you really need, what it is that's really holding things back.
Yeah. Next section here is on cloud and technology evolution. You've led teams through major cloud migrations. What lessons can construction finance leaders take away about modernization and risk management?
Yeah, so there's a bunch of lessons learned, I guess, from the purely software engineering side of things, but that's not really relevant to anyone in construction accounting. The big things, though, that I do think carry over are, for example, in software, you don't really want to ever do a big rewrite of everything. You want to do it in little steps, piece by piece, replace or fix in chunks that are manageable. You never want to basically knock the entire house down and start over again. And with anyone in construction finance, think of their entire process. You never want to totally overhaul the entire process all in one go. Not only is that going to be horribly expensive, it's almost definitely going to be broken once you put it back together again. So do it in little pieces, step by step. Another one is when you do these kinds of migrations in software, making sure that visibility, monitoring, are things working the way you expect? That's a key part. And so when you do something like, from the construction accounting side, if I bring in a new software vendor or add a new tool into the mix, well, are you monitoring to see if that tool or that service is actually helping you? Because that helps in two ways. One struggle we've seen is trying to convince people that using our software is going to help them. They might say, it might help, but not very much. Well, did you sit down and run the numbers? Do you have any way of checking? And I don't mean that in a bad way, but when you implement something new, it'd be good to know, did it really make a measurable improvement? Did I go from spending 6 hours of time chasing down lien waivers from subcontractors to 20 minutes? If you don't have visibility into that, you'll never know. So basically, whenever you're trying to modernize something, whether it's software or your process, you need to just figure out the blast radius and minimize it as much as possible. Detonate a nuke over your entire business because you want to just change everything because you're so sick of it. Do it in pieces.
Small manageable changes. How do you approach balancing innovations, AI, automation, new features with the need for stability and compliance in financial systems?
Yeah. So I'll take a little slight on software engineers here for a sec. Whenever there's a new technology around, I think just about every software engineer looks at this new cool thing and they want to play with it. It's the new shiny little ball that they want to chase. It's software that's not a good idea because, I mean, sure, it might be something good and useful, but there's all sorts of weird dark corners of where things can go wrong that you don't know. And no one knows if it's going to be a waste of time or not. And if you immediately start jamming something brand new into a stable system, now you've just shaken everything up and you might ruin it all. So when you look at sort of the accounting process, you really need to make sure you keep the stuff I'm experimenting with away from the stuff that you're really using, your system of record. Do you have some guardrails in place? Maybe your ERP system lets you set up multiple companies. AI is a big one. You don't want to just randomly throw AI in and say, wow, magic. You have no idea if it's working or not. This is where service providers can actually be a pretty big help because, like your software, you do a lot of OCR of documents. If I were to just randomly try and do it myself because it's cool and new, I'm probably going to fall flat on my face. But if I can go to a service provider like you guys that have been doing this for a while, you kind of know what you're doing, it's a lot safer. You're not likely to go and suddenly destabilize the entire business by bringing it in. So there are good ways of introducing some of this new stuff while still being stable. I would really hope that the leaders in these organizations are able to kind of tell the difference and, don't accidentally break everything because you're playing with something new and fun. So,
Yeah, as you said, it's such a good way. AI is inherently statistical. You throw the
uh,
same input at it twice, it's not gonna give you the same output. You know.
yeah, you just got to, you know, there's people that's all they do all day, every day is they figure out how to make it better, make it safer, make it higher quality. And, you know, that's probably a really good situation where buying instead of building it yourself is, a smart choice, not just a financial cost. I mean, I'd mentioned you guys doing your OCR stuff. I mean, OCR has been a problem just in business for ages. I mean, I remember 10 years ago, 15 years ago, um, it was like magical if you could do any sort of OCR work. And then it felt like you're constantly fighting the system, even with systems that weren't using AI. So in some ways, AI has really made it a lot easier. But, it's really good to see how some of these new features are finally being a lot more accessible. I mean, I hate sitting down at a computer and typing in stuff from documents all day. I have to do that around tax season and I hate it. I'd much rather say, here, AI, please do it for me.
Yeah, great point. For the listeners who don't know what we do, we are a construction AP automation solution. Now, the last section here, Samuel's on leadership, team building, and career. You manage distributed teams across the US and Brazil. What cultural or structural practices helped maintain accountability and performance?
Yeah, so I got to cheat a little bit on this one because I worked for a couple of years in Brazil, and now it's been probably 12 years now. I wound up marrying someone who's from Brazil. So, you know, my wife and I, we speak Portuguese, kids speak Portuguese, we go to Brazil all the time. So the language barrier, mostly non-existent. I mean, software lingo is very different. And so that helped a lot with managing teams that are kind of geo-distributed. But whether it was a different country or just a different state even, there were a few things that really jumped out. So, first of all, it's communication. You're not sitting next to each other in an office anymore. So you have to be able to communicate properly. You have to know who's in charge of what, who owns the work, when is the work done. And you have to have some rituals. I mean, we don't ever call them rituals, I don't think, but meetings where you do some planning, demos, view stuff that you've done. Think of this as like maybe you have a meeting at the end of month closeout for the accounting team. If you've got a diverse team in different parts of the country or something, do you guys sit down and have a meeting to talk about how the last month went? Do you talk about what everyone's doing? What maybe someone was overloaded this last month? Who knows? And to some extent, metrics and measuring like, how long did things take? How much work did everyone have to do? Now, these are all things that are not focused on butt in the chair time, but more just how much was produced, what was the outcome. And to some extent, that's a much more valuable thing to measure as well. So if I were to sort of sum it up, it's not that remote teams lower any standards, which I know was sort of an issue early on with remote work being a big thing, but it really sort of exposes if you even have standards at all. If you never have those kinds of meetings, if you never have those kinds of follow-ups, that kind of situation will make it very obvious very quickly.
Yeah. Having founded multiple ventures, what advice would you give to finance leaders or founders trying to scale from small teams to enterprise systems?
So this is obviously going to be an opinion, not gospel, but pretty quickly you have to figure out how to be so dependent on people, whether it's yourself or business partners or early employees, and become a lot more dependent on the system, whether it's the systems you're building or other systems that you can rely on. So, for example, on the software side, there's things like tools to watch what your software is doing, tools to make new releases of your code. Um, these are all things that you really need. You could watch it manually, but that's a problem. Earlier, we talked about how little does a human have to get in the middle, and so when you look at now an accounting department, or any kind of founder, how much of the work are you having to do by hand? Going back to what I'd said about the bakery that I used to run, one of the things that I knew was going to be painful, but I didn't really know how bad until I got there, was how expensive people are. People are so expensive. I mean, I don't remember the exact numbers then, but it felt like it was 3/4 of all my expenses were basically salaries. And so it was in my interest to say, well, it might be a whole lot cheaper for me to buy a piece of equipment or some other system to make me less dependent on people. And you need that to grow. You can't have tons and tons of people doing small little jobs. If you can, you pay for a computer to do as much of the work as you can. So don't hire heroes if you don't have to. I mean, it's good to have them. Basically, if you don't have a platform or a product or something that you can use to help you, you basically have a giant bottleneck. That's what I would say. And just don't throw your money out the window right away. Be clever about it.
Yeah. System dependence over people dependence as you scale. Finally, looking ahead, what excites you most about the next 5 years of construction finance technology?
So I'll be biased here. It's making the back office for construction firms feel less like you're on an archaeological dig and more like you have some real-time control. It's even with running my own businesses, it's very painful to say, well, how much did something cost me? Or where did all this money go? Or why were things late? It really does feel like you're on a bit of a dig to go through the system, run the right reports to kind of piece the puzzle together to answer these questions. Some of them might be, once in a lifetime things you have to answer, but if it can feel a lot more real time, a lot more control over what's going on, better integrations, things tied together better, less humans, more automation, it's all of these things pieced together are really where I'm excited to see things go. It's not exciting, it's not sexy, but these are the kinds of things that make a real impact. If you've got 2 or 3 people maybe that are in charge of a portion of your finance department, well, how much can you grow with those 2 or 3 people? Can you sort of empower them by giving them some software that'll help them automate their jobs? One of the things that scared everyone, I think still does to some extent with AI, is a lot of people feel like it's going to take their jobs away from them. But I think that blinded a lot of people to how much these tools, whether it's an AI tool or something else, isn't really there to take your job away, but it's really there to help you do more with your time that you got. I don't know who wants to go back to a time where you have to carry your clothes to the river to get them washed. I'm perfectly happy to give it to a machine to wash it for me. I don't think anyone feels slighted by that. And, a lot of these things I think are the same. I don't know that anyone really wants to be doing the grunt work. Do something more interesting and more useful and let the machine do as much of that as you can.
Yeah. I think people are scared of like a rogue AI taking over and making you and I slaves.
Yes. Yeah, so I'm sure we've all seen movies like that, but at least for now, you got a long ways to go for that.
Yeah. How far do you think we are from a rogue AI controlling us?
Well, I don't know. I've seen people trying to do all sorts of crazy things now, but I don't know. Part of the problem is I think both you and I, we kind of know from the technical side what these things can do. I think we're a very long ways still from Skynet, but, maybe a lot sooner we can, just don't let anyone build a robot and then put a gun in the robot's hands and then say, okay, go do things. Let's not do that, but
Yeah.
For all the boring things though, great. I love it.
Yeah. Samuel, thank you so much coming on to the show. I had a great conversation with you.
Yeah, I appreciate it.
Thanks for listening to Finance at the Job Site. If you found today's conversation valuable, share it with a teammate and subscribe so you don't miss the next episode. You can listen on Apple Podcasts or Spotify or watch on YouTube. Just search Finance at the Job Site. Until next time, here is to building smarter, faster, and more profitable projects.